We overthink the things that we do. It could come from a lack of belonging. It could come from feeling numb and wanting to feel. It could come from a whole range of different underlying unmet drives. And so get in touch with what that is.
Welcome to LoveLink, your guide to relationships in all forms. We're your hosts, Dr. Sina and Simone. Today we're discussing overthinking in men. Here to discuss this phenomenon, its impact, and what to do about it is Dr. Jett Stone. Dr. Stone is a writer and clinical psychologist specializing in the psychology of men. He has a private practice in Connecticut, is a regular contributor to Psychology Today, and has written for the New York Times, The Guardian, and Fortune magazine. His most recent book, Quiet Your Mind, A Men's Guide, is a book that explains why men worry and overthink, and provides evidence-based strategies to overcoming mental roadblocks and finding clarity. Welcome, Jett.
Thank you. Really glad to be here.
Really excited to have you. So I just want to disclose to our audience that you and I, Jett, have worked together in the past. We were interns at the VA. We were bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and early in our careers. And now you have this book coming out. And it's so amazing to see you writing and this accomplishment. And I have your book right here. So we're really excited to pick your brain about Quiet Your Mind, A Men's Guide. So tell us a little bit about what your inspiration was to writing this book.
Well, it really began with my blog on Psychology Today, which it's called Souls of Men. And I started writing it a few years ago, and I was trying to tackle the male mind, make it more three-dimensional and full color, in the sense that I talked about fathering, I talked about male deficits and male strengths. You know, I have blog posts about boyhood nicknames and male bonding. And so I just started trying to write in a way that I didn't see a lot out there. So in our graduate school training, there was a lot of talk around male deficits and compensating fears of being dominated and dominating others. And I feel like it was a picture of men and masculinity that felt oversimplified at times. And so in a way, with this blog, what I was trying to do was complicate the male mind in the best way possible, and just write about my experiences working with men in psychotherapy. And so over the course of time, I eventually got reached out to by a publisher, Penguin Random House, who was interested in having me write a guidebook to help men overcome overthinking. They had some research on their end saying that this was overthinking, which is a term to describe rumination and worry. We'll get more into that later, was something that men searched in terms of books. I also found it to be a term that was easy for men to talk about. It's an approachable term, overthinking. And so they proposed this idea of a guidebook, and we talked it through and eventually sketched out what it would look like. And it turned into what it is, which is 24 tools that men can use to help overcome overthinking. All evidence-based, based on my own clinical experience, based on research that I looked at over the course of a lot of time. And it was an outgrowth of my blog, essentially. And, it was an incredible experience to do, and came out in October of 2024.
So Jett, what have been your experiences working with men around overthinking? What have you seen in patients?
Rumination and worry is something that we all deal with to some degree. Men are much more likely to describe that process as overthinking. Like I said, it's an approachable term. And so with men, in my book, I talk about like deciding between two reasonable options. So a good example of that might be like in a dating environment where you send out a text and it's unanswered. And there's a lot going on in terms of what that could be. It could look like dwelling on past inactions, meaning losing friendships over the course of time is a theme that we see a lot in men. Men tend to kind of store away their friendships and tap into them when they're needed. And so I do hear a lot of rumination about friendships that they had, let's say in high school or college, and then lost into adulthood. And then there's the type of overthinking that can be high stress sort of perfectionism, preparing for presentations or trying to get it just right. And that's another big one. Some of the themes can include everything from health, fathering. You hear a lot about finance, and there's still a lot of provider anxieties that I work with in my practice as well. So that's just a sort of broad landscape of how overthinking can show up. The things that come up that are uniquely male often center around performance-based aspects of, say, being a dad. Competence, in relationships, sometimes it's magnifying small imperfections in someone else and stewing over that, kneading on that dough over and over and over again. And issues related to self-reliance, not reaching out for help. And so then you're alone trying to tackle a problem all by yourself. And that's something that I hear a lot about, especially for those guys who are more isolated.
Yeah, it's interesting that you use the word overthinking a lot in your book because it's just so much more accessible for men. Do you find, I've certainly found this in my practice, that men really struggle to reach out for help or connect to their peers, and so they are more alone in this experience of overthinking versus women?
Yes. Men more than ever now are alienated, especially young men. They are not only alienated from their own feelings and values and drives, but they're alienated in terms of education. If you look at boys and men falling behind in education achievement and outcomes, they're more alone in relationships. I think it's something like 15% of men say they have no close friends at all. That's up, I think, from 1990, which was at 3%. We're more fragmented. We're more isolated, just in the way that our societies are built. And so when you're alone, you can be more prone to overthinking because it's just you, yourself, and mulling over, stewing over something that happened. And I think that men have less of a inclination to reach out during those times. There's sort of a masculine script that, you can sort of handle this by yourself. It's a self-reliance thing that we're talking about. And that, reaching out or asking for help is a kind of weakness, or not trusting that if you do reach out for help, you're going to get what you need. And so I do get the sense that the more isolated the person is that I'm working with, chances are the more they're going to overthink. And as we've talked about, it's a layperson term, but really what it means is rumination and worry. It's thinking that is overstayed its welcome. I like to use it that way. It's overstayed its welcome and outlived its usefulness. And the term in psychology for it is called repetitive negative thinking. We can talk more about what that is, but if there's a term in psychology that corresponds to overthinking, it would be repetitive negative thinking. That's what academic researchers, it's a construct that they've put together.
Can you break these terms down a little bit just for our listeners? What is worry versus rumination versus repetitive negative thinking?
Versus anxiety, too.
Yes.
Versus anxiety.
Yes, I'll do my best. So repetitive negative thinking describes a process and content. So the process is repetitive, right? The negative part is the content. And so worry is, think of it as a question what if? It's a verbal chain, oftentimes, of thinking. It views events as controllable, almost like if I can just sort of model out and predict something in the future better, and it intensifies anxiety. Rumination is more like the question why. It's looking back. It sees events as uncontrollable in a way. You're looking back in the past and digging for insight, and that can drag you deeper into depression. And so initially, decades ago, overthinking was really synonymous with rumination, which is, as I was talking about, sort of a passive focus on your symptoms of depression. Why am I doing so poorly? Why am I so depressed? But over the course of time, researchers found that, oh my gosh, the process in worry and the process of rumination are similar. It's repetitive, it's critical, and it's very, very hard to control. And so they combined it into a construct called repetitive negative thinking, which combines worry and rumination. Worry is more future focused, rumination is more past focused, but they overlap. And repetitive negative thinking is transdiagnostic, meaning that it cuts across different mental health conditions, like everything from OCD to depression to anxiety to PTSD, insomnia, addiction. What they found is that is a common factor, this construct between all of these different types of conditions. Now, anxiety is different. It's a feeling state of uncertainty or unpredictability about the future. Within anxiety, you have worry, which is much more verbally mediated. It's more of a process than it is in a feeling state. And then worry is the sort of the quintessential symptom of generalized anxiety. So anxiety is a broader category, and worry is a mental process that you go through, oftentimes when you are in an anxious state.
And what's the impact of overthinking? Like how, you mentioned depression. Can you speak a little bit about its effects on men?
Yeah, in men, well, first off, let me say that data has found that women tend to overthink more than men, right? I question that because men do underreport their symptoms, and that the consequences of men's overthinking can be much more dire. Men have 4 times the suicide rate as women do. They're 3 times more likely to overdose, let's say. And so what they found is that repetitive negative thinking can lead to deaths of despair. It's part of the process. So studies on suicide, studies on substance use, we'll talk about and we'll look at repetitive negative thinking, and you'll see that it's sometimes a moderator or a mediator of those outcomes. And so it can have very big consequences for men. The overthinking is, like we talked about, a very approachable word, but when it gets extreme is when it starts to have some really dire consequences for men.
Yeah. It must be such a big experience for men to come into your office and begin to talk about what they've been holding for so long. Yes. I wonder what you experience, what you notice the first time men enter into therapy and they've been sitting with all of this inside, all of this overthinking.
Yeah, sometimes it takes time to unfold, so you don't see it session 1. A lot of what I've been thinking about as a therapist is how to build better bonds with men. And so once you build that trust, you could start to see what lives beneath the overthinking. And that's part of what I was trying to do with this book, is take it from a process that's abstract and critical, very self-focused, to something that's more experiential and grounded. And so my experience is that when you're sitting across from someone who is struggling with overthinking, if you can help them find the meaning and purpose and drives and unmet drives that live beneath the overthinking, you're going to be in a much better place. But I would say it even starts before that. It starts understanding what overthinking is, which I just talked about first, so you can identify your triggers. When do I start to do that? Is it when I start thinking about my finances? Is it when I send a email out? Is it when I'm texting friends and they don't respond? Or maybe it's at work. My boss is going into a meeting and I don't know what they're going to talk about. I was thinking about that, as a psychology trainee, we're constantly being evaluated. There's, in our intern year, Simone, you'll remember there's meetings where the door is closed and they're talking about us. And that ambiguity is like rocket fuel for overthinking. It could send you time traveling to the future.
Yeah. I've also experienced working with men that so many of them, because they haven't shared the overthinking, their internal worlds with anyone else, there's this kind of profoundness about being the therapist and kind of pulling apart the curtains for the first time for some men, not all men, but for many of them. And just to be able to tell and share and have some of their feelings be normalized is just so cathartic. It's like this huge first step in not feeling like they're crazy or feeling like they're not so alone in it.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing when we talk about men and overthinking is that we talk about how the more alienated you are, right? It could also be a trigger for overthinking. But for those who are in vibrant relationships and who, let's say, have a family, men are being tasked with doing a lot more. They're adding to their self-complexity now in a way that they were not in generations ago. I think the old scripts of masculinity are getting torn up, and there's really an unclear future. What's the new script for men? And my sense is, in working with them, is like, okay, I'm working, but so is let's say my wife. I'm a parent, but so is my wife. There's this sense that I now have to be ideal on the work front and on the home front and on the caregiving front. And so when you have those multiple identities, again, that's more fuel for overthinking, because then you're worrying about more things. And so, a good example of that would be if I'm working with someone a father, let's say, who, they're trying to get the kid out the door. And maybe a father would say, oh, forget it. Like, they could just wear shorts and go outside of school in the winter. Right? I deal with this, my kids all the time, like just improperly dressing for the weather. I'll talk to a father and be like, I don't know why my wife just, is so demanding that she wants them to put on a pair of pants to get them out. But the thing is that their worry extends into the future. Well, if they get a cold or they get sick then I'm going to be the one who's going to be on the front line taking care of them. But now we're sort of seeing men that, well, no, so will I. I will actually have to do the labor of having to deal with that as well. And so once you take on more responsibility, it's like, I'm not just going to go out to work. I'm also a fully engaged caregiver. I think that adds in more fuel for worry, which is, as we talked about, extending into the future. And so long story short is that men are taking on a lot more, and they're at times confused and bewildered. And that is another element of overthinking that I see in my work, especially with fathers.
I was just going to say, I'm also thinking just about the political landscape right now and about how much concern there is for young men, particularly young white men, who feel really left behind and forgotten and maybe don't have the job that they imagined or don't have the family that they thought they would have and are really angry. And I imagine that there's some kind of overthinking. There's an overthinking undercurrent around that anger too.
Yeah, I mean, I've spent a lot of time trying to reconcile that because it's all over the news. I get a sense that politics, speaks to people's values, and it was less about substance and more about style in this election for young men, and that they veered right in part because they were spoken to, they were addressed. Their needs were at least attempted to be taken on, right? And I do get the sense that the left never really explicitly talked about the needs of men. And so we get into that alienated thing. Young men, I got the sense, were alienated by the left. And at least, if nothing else, were talked to by the right. Maybe not in a productive way, but they felt seen. They felt like they were needed. And this idea of neededness really is important for men that I work with. And so the right won on style as opposed to substance. I think there's a whole making sense of what happened in this last election that is going to be going on for the next several years.
Hi, LoveLink listeners. Our group practice, Modern Mind, is located in New York City with offices in Brooklyn and Manhattan, offering in-person and virtual psychotherapy. We provide individual, couples, and group therapy, as well as ketamine-assisted psychotherapy in conjunction with a psychiatry prescriber. Therapy is a powerful experience that can transform your life and help you live it to its full potential. We're here to help take you where you want to go. To find out more about our practice, visit www.modernmind.co or email info@modernmind.co to be connected with one of our therapists.
It is really worrying to hear about what's going on with young men, which you just talked about earlier. I was reading this thing recently that was talking about affirmative action for men in colleges. It's still pretty much a 50-50 split. And then Tulane University stopped affirmative action for boys. And now there's like a 70-30 split. So it's 70% female, 30% male when they weren't accepting people based on their gender, which is really kind of scary for young men. Like that there's this failure to thrive element that's going on.
There is.
How do you understand that?
I have two daughters, and one of them goes to school with a shirt that says the future is female. I don't know who makes it, if it's like Old Navy or Gap or something. It's awesome. The empowerment of girls and women is like, that should not be stopped, but we could do two things at the same time. We can talk about the struggles of men and continue to empower girls and women. And so what ends up happening is, I think starting at a very young age, boys start to feel, again, to use that word, alienated from the education process. Girls tend to do better. They're just better students earlier on. And it's partly because of brain development, a lot of other things. And that extends into college. Their GPAs are also higher than boys across school. They're more ambitious. They're doing more study abroad programs in college. And you're starting to see this drift of boys and young men from education, even from relationships too. I think under 30, maybe a third haven't had sex in the last year. There's some stat like that. So there's this drift from intimacy, and it just extends out into all these different domains. And my sense is that came to a head in the election too.
Well, I'm just thinking there's like a whole generation of men that are likely to be overthinkers. I mean, that are in this, probably, I'm imagining, a state of worry and rumination.
Yes.
A lot of negative thinking and negative self-view when they see themselves as not, meeting the expectations of the culture.
Yes. And they're online and they're on Reddit, they're on YouTube, they're watching porn, they're watching video games. And so the time spent, being out in the world, meeting new people, taking chances has been reduced. And that, a lot of what overthinking is can be conceptualized as defensive or experiential avoidance, right? We rely on thinking instead of getting it in touch with our feelings and our needs and wants and drives. And so as opposed to doing that, it's like a quick fix is right at our fingertips. And it's a way of sort of dulling, numbing, escaping, fleeing your feelings. And that when next time, you pull away from the screen and then you feel more the intensity of shame and fear or whatever it is that can help fuel overthinking.
Yeah, so we know what doesn't help. It sounds like substance abuse, social media, videos, isolation. What can we do to help men stop overthinking? What do you do with your clients to help them stop overthinking?
I'm going to answer that question. I just want to go into a little bit how overthinking begins and how it's thought of, and then talk about solutions and some of the tools you can use. So overthinking is a habit, meaning that something in your environment triggers you, and then you engage in worry and rumination in the presence of it. It could be sending out an email. It could be walking past a building, or it could be watching something on TV that triggers a thing. We have a network, a web of triggers that can activate worry and rumination. The next thing that continues it is executive control, meaning that our brain has difficulty inhibiting responses to overthinking, meaning it's very hard to hold back from overthinking. So there's the executive control part. The third part is the abstract processing, which is basically, it's the tendency to think about issues in a very broad and vague way. It's not on the concrete details. And then the next aspect of overthinking that keeps it going is the goal discrepancies. It's like the difference between where you are and where you want to be. And then negativity bias. We can take neutral things and spin them into negative, right? So all those things combined, that's what the research shows, starts overthinking and continues it. Now, the way that you get out of overthinking, or find quiet, to use the title of my book, is by getting grounded and taking a more, what they call like a concrete stance on your thinking. But it really begins earlier than that. It begins understanding what overthinking is, being able to catch it in the moment and ask yourself, is this productive? Am I able to control it? Is any more thinking going to help me beyond what I've already done so far? And once you catch that, then you at least can see it. And in my book, I talk about catching the triggers, and sometimes it means getting outside and literally just going for a walk. Because if you try to apply more thinking to your thinking, it's unproductive. But I think there's this myth that, if we're just a little bit more rational, if we apply more reason to this problem through thinking, we could somehow solve it or resolve the ambiguity. But the reality is that sometimes catching the overthinking and then taking a break with movement can be incredibly helpful. So that's one of the things that I talk about in my book. And I think for men, oftentimes we can catch our body symptoms, our aches and pains and injuries, and we can talk about some of the feelings and problems that we have through our bodies. And so one of the first skills that I talk about in this book is called the cyclic sigh, which is just a type of breathing that can kind of get you from a sympathetic, autonomic nervous system activated state down to a parasympathetic rest and digest. So getting in touch with your body is another good first start. The mind and the body are in constant communication. And if you can target the body, then you can have a chance at targeting the mind.
I wonder if you have any advice for men in terms of how they can be in relationship when they're struggling with overthinking. Because on the one hand, talking a lot about the worries of the rumination can sometimes increase overthinking, I'm imagining. And yet also there can be something really beneficial probably for a guy to talk to his partner about what's going on and get some empathy and support. So I wonder, how you think about that.
There's oftentimes a fear or an unmet aspiration or drive that lives beneath overthinking, that it's not just random, that the habit forms because there's something in there that you really care about. We don't overthink the things that we don't care about. We overthink the things that we do. And so if you're able to spot that and get to know that, and there are tools in here that, there's writing tools that I have in this book that can kind of help you track that, map that, meaning that it could come from a lack of belonging. It could come from feeling numb and wanting to feel. It could come from a whole range of different underlying, unmet drives. And so get in touch with what that is. Like I said, there is a lot of loneliness I'm finding in men today, and that there is this sense of like, where do I belong? Where am I needed? What's my highest and best use? And, oftentimes when you talk about it in that frame, you get them out of their minds and a little bit more grounded in, okay, like what can I then do? Like, how can I find my people, a community, a space where I feel like I can address that underlying need? That's important. And there's values in there too. We could talk about identifying your values. There's unmet values in overthinking as well. And so that's one way to get grounded.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I like this idea of really anchoring in values and drives and thinking about what you're working towards rather than just trying to ignore or shift out of the negative thought pattern. I'm also wondering how negative core beliefs play into this and how they really drive maybe some of these patterns of thought around being a failure or being incompetent. And is that something that you address directly when thinking about overthinking?
Yes. If you're carrying around a core belief that I'm unworthy or I'm stupid, I'm unlovable, let's say, about yourself, or a belief about the world, let's say, the world is dangerous, something to that effect, you can catch something in your environment and kind of twist it back to that core belief. So our overthinking kind of runs through that filter of our core belief systems. And so it's a good question, because to get grounded requires you to understand how your worldview, how you see yourself, how you see the world, how you see others, because that can tell you a lot about why you're overthinking and how to overcome it. Because if you feel like the world is dangerous, then you're going to interpret something that's neutral in your environment potentially as dangerous. So when you approach it at that angle, I think it's a way of helping anyone get out of their head, and not just men. For men, the core belief that you see a lot is I'm unneeded or unwanted or incompetent.
I think so helpful in distancing, right? Because if they believe it so much, they don't even recognize that there could be a filter even there in the first place.
That's right.
And so once they notice this pattern and they recognize, oh, wow, this is my pattern, this is something specific to me, and not everyone sees the world this way, that kind of detaches them a little bit from that belief and then those patterns.
That's right. And talking about it that way, also, I try to normalize overthinking for men most of us do it to some degree. There are some people who identify more as chronic overthinkers, and there are some people who identify as underthinkers as well. But if you normalize the process of overthinking, it's very helpful, because there's an aloneness to it. For some of the men that I work with, it's like, oh gosh, am I the only one who is, going over and over and over the problems that I have, or obsessing over the details? And so once you normalize it, I think it's incredibly freeing.
Mm-hmm. And even acknowledge its utility. Like it's happening for a reason, it's not working, but it's there as a protective mechanism that we can honor.
Absolutely, yes. It's thinking gone awry. It's rationality and problem solving, and you're trying to tackle something, but it's outlived its usefulness to you. And being able to catch that and just acknowledge it non-judgmentally is a really good beginning step.
And we all, I think, work with a lot of couples, and I see this all the time where both partners are overthinking, but it often is the women who share and the men who feel like they have to figure it out on their own. And then it creates this false interpretation for the women that men don't care and they're not thinking about anything. And that the wife feels or the female partner can feel very alone in the relationship. And then also the male partner feels very alone because he's holding all of these thoughts to himself, and there's a distance that gets created. And so I think to Sina's point, and Jett, what you were speaking to before about sharing with your community, I think there's a real importance in romantic relationships around men speaking up, because it's a way not only for them to not have to burden themselves alone with this, but also it's a way to strengthen the romantic relationship.
Yes, in EFT, which I think we've all trained in at some point, the withdrawer in the relationship, not always, but is often a man. And what they're doing is they're pulling back to keep the peace, but it's not as if they're just going blank and doing that to harm their partner. There's a lot going on upstairs. And I think one of the challenges in working with a withdrawer or working with men in general is helping open that up for them and helping give them words and give them some confidence in being vulnerable. And so a lot of what happens with overthinking in men is that it can go into the extreme, meaning that there's withdraw. It can look like stonewalling or, contempt. Or there's the externalizing behaviors, which are also important to talk about, that thinking sort of gets translated into hard drinking, hyperactivity, driving fast. And so you don't see the thinking, or you don't see the interior, when on the outside, you see something that just needs to be contained. In relationships, just to go back to that, it can look like withdrawal, or it can look like extreme anger sometimes too. And in both of those extremes, it's very difficult to work with as a therapist. But I think it's really important to be able to manage that in the room, because those are men's responses to overthinking that's sometimes been accumulated over time, meaning that they've spent a lot of time alone brooding on something. And then when they're trying to talk about it, it can look really intense in the room. And handling that intensity is something that is really important to try to do with men.
I wonder, Jett, if you could speak to your own experience as a man around just your own experience with overthinking and your journey to find your center and get more grounded.
Yes, I think in the process of writing this book, it was my own experiential in overthinking. This was the first book that I wrote, and I think the theme of my overthinking is a lot of times over accuracy so I don't do harm. And like, there's so much research people have put into in worry and rumination. I am not the first person to try and tackle it. And so in the process of trying to get it right in these tools and make sure that they have a science foundation was one thing that I definitely overthought, because I wanted to make this book practical and clear and short and to the point. And it's hard to translate all of that information into that. And so I definitely stewed over that. And it means a lot to me that, when I'm writing, I want to get it right. And so I think of it as like, there's no final draft for me. And sometimes when you spot your overthinking, as I did quite a bit in writing this book, I'm like, just send it to the editor, right? And then take a walk outside and come back to it and do some of that breathing, do some of that grounding. Like, why am I so worked up about perfectionistic quality? Well, it's because I care a lot about getting it right and doing right by the people who did the research. And so I can get very, very detail oriented in my writing. It reminds me of like combing my daughter's hair, right? After the shower, you didn't use any conditioner. And it's like, I could do that, like, and find a knot in it each time I brush. It's the same thing with my writing. Each time I can look at it, I can continue to find a new knot, like, just keep going and keep going. So that was the story from this book. And it was interesting to think and write about these skills while also experiencing it yourself.
So meta.
Absolutely.
Yes.
I know, very meta.
I love that.
Yes, very meta.
So now that the book is out and people are reading it, do you have a new kind of overthinking, or has that been kind of quelled and you've like released it into the wild and you're accepting however it's being received?
The ambiguity, now it's still in the early phases of how it'll be received, is something that I'm definitely dealing with. I've spoken to a lot of people about this book now, men, people who are in the psychology field and not in the psychology field. And I get the sense that the book has been a helpful adjunct to psychotherapy. It's not a replacement for psychotherapy in any way, right? My goal with it was that there would be a gateway to psychotherapy, and then could it be a helpful adjunct to therapists who are working with men. And so a lot of my overthinking was like, okay, what has been the effect? Like, how are people taking this in? How do psychodynamic clinicians look at this who aren't so tool-based? I was psychodynamically trained, and I did training afterwards in the CBTs. And so there was just a lot of reflection and pondering about how this will be received. It kind of crossed that borderline into worry. And so mostly, though, I think it's gotten a good reception so far, and I'm trying to be proud of it. It's not always easy to do that. It's hard to sit with that. I enjoyed actually the writing part of it much more than the post-production element.
It's hard to be proud. I resonate with that one.
Yes. Yes.
Me too. It's a big deal to write a book. I just want to say that. That's a really big accomplishment. So we can feel celebratory on your behalf.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Wow.
We're proud of you.
We're proud of you, yeah.
So where can people find your book?
You can find the book on Amazon, Target, Barnes & Noble, most places.
Maybe a good holiday book for the men in your life.
Yes, it's a good stocking stuffer. It's thin, it can be bendable, you can put it,
Especially for the holidays, right?
Yeah. I think
Not to
the
overthink.
timing.
Family and all the triggers and stressors.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And one last question, which we ask everyone, how can people find you?
So I have an Instagram account. It's flex.flexibility. I am on Instagram, I'm on X, I'm on LinkedIn. If you just Google my name, I have some content on all those platforms.
Well, this was so great, and I think will be so helpful for a lot of men. Even just the first piece is just normalizing.
Yes.
That this is happening to other men, not just you.
Yeah, and I think the tools in the book are comprehensive and not based in one therapy brand. And so it ranges from ways to create calm to stress and time management tools to taking perspective. Well, chapter 4 is all about kind of how to find some breathing room from your overthinking. And so there's a whole range of tools. And my hope is that men will come and they'll find at least a couple of things that they can take home.